Picture a perfect wedding in the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, where laughter turns to horror as a guest drops dead from a poisoned cake. Was it the baker, the bride, the groom, or a bitter rival? Join Miss Marple as she unravels a web of jealousy, secrets, and deadly intent, piecing together clues from village gossip, a stray hairpin, and a fatal dose of aconite. In just 30 seconds, dive into a classic Agatha Christie mystery where no one is what they seem and the truth is as sharp as a needle. Chapter 1. The Joyous Occasion. The late summer sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, where the village square hummed with the gentle excitement of a much-anticipated event. The wedding of Miss Clara Wentworth to Mr. Thomas Harwood was the talk of every cottage and shop, a union that seemed to promise the kind of happiness one reads about in novels. The church, with its ancient stone walls draped in ivy, had been decked with white lilies, their scent mingling with the crisp air. Inside the village hall, a modest but charming space, preparations for the reception were in full swing. Tables groaned under starched cloths, laden with crystal glasses and Mrs. Bantry's prized damson preserves. At the center of it all stood the wedding cake, a three-tiered marvel of sugar roses and delicate piping, crafted by Mr. Percival Reed, the village baker whose skill was as renowned as his temper was mild. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a corner near the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, adjusted her lace shawl and surveyed the scene with her usual unobtrusive keenness. Her eyes, bright and bird-like behind her spectacles, missed nothing. The flutter of Clara's veil as she laughed with her bridesmaids, the proud tilt of Thomas's head as he greeted guests, and the deft movements of the serving girls weaving through the crowd. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. She had known Clara since the girl was a child, all golden curls and earnest smiles, and Thomas, a solicitor with a reputation for fairness, seemed a fitting match. Yet weddings, Miss Marple knew, were not merely celebrations. They were stages where human nature played out its quiet dramas. As the guests mingled, their voices a cheerful hum, Miss Marple's gaze fell upon Miss Lavinia Gray, standing near the punch bowl. Lavinia, with her elegant posture and a green silk dress that caught the light, was a striking figure. She was not a native of St. Mary Mead, but had settled here some years ago, her charm and sharp wit making her a fixture at social gatherings. Yet, there was something in her demeanor today, a tightness about her mouth, a flicker in her eyes that suggested more than polite interest in the festivities. Miss Marple recalled the village whispers. Lavinia had once set her cap at Thomas Harwood, only to see him choose Clara. Such disappointments, Miss Marple mused, could leave a sting, though Lavinia's composed exterior betrayed little. The vicar, Mr. Clement, rose to offer a toast, his voice warm with goodwill. "To Clara and Thomas," he said, raising a glass. "May their life together be as sweet as this splendid cake." Laughter rippled through the room, and Mr. Reed, standing near the kitchen door, flushed with pride. Miss Marple noted his expression, a mix of relief and satisfaction, as if the cake's perfection were a personal triumph. She also observed Clara's quick glance toward Lavinia, a fleeting look that held something, nervousness, perhaps. Or was it merely the jitters of a bride? The moment came for the cake cutting, and the guests gathered round, their faces alight with anticipation. Clara and Thomas, hand in hand, wielded the silver knife with practiced grace, slicing into the soft sponge as cameras clicked and cheers erupted. Plates were passed, and the first bites were taken with murmurs of delight. Miss Marple declined a slice, citing her digestion, but watched closely as others partook. Mr. George Baxter, a portly man with a booming laugh, took a hearty bite and declared it a triumph of confectionery. His joviality was infectious, yet Miss Marple's attention lingered on Lavinia, who had not touched the cake but stood watching, her hands clasped tightly. The room was alive with chatter when a sudden choking gasp cut through the noise. Mr. Baxter staggered, his face purpling, his plate clattering to the floor. Guests froze, their smiles fading as he clutched his throat and collapsed. Dr. Haydock, present among the guests, rushed forward, his expression grim. Miss Marple, her knitting forgotten, leaned forward, her mind already sifting through the scene. The hall fell silent, save for a stifled sob from Clara and a sharp intake of breath from someone. She could not tell who. As Dr. Haydock knelt beside Baxter, Miss Marple's eyes darted to the faces around her. Mr. Reed's ashen pallor, Thomas's clenched jaw, Clara's trembling hands, and Lavinia's unreadable stare. Something, she knew, was terribly wrong, and the joyous occasion had taken a dark turn. Chapter 2. A Sudden Tragedy. The village hall of St. Mary Mead, so recently alive with the clinking of glasses and the murmur of cheerful voices, had transformed in an instant into a tableau of shock and dread. The collapse of Mr. George Baxter, his ruddy face contorted in agony as he crumpled to the polished floor, had silenced the wedding guests as effectively as a thunderclap. The air, heavy with the scent of lilies and sugar, now seemed to carry a chill, as if the very walls sensed the intrusion of something sinister. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the vicar's wife, had set her knitting aside, her hands still but her mind racing. Her sharp eyes, undimmed by age, moved from face to face, noting the pallor of some, the wide-eyed panic of others, and the peculiar stillness of one or two who stood apart from the chaos. Dr. Haydock, a man whose calm professionalism was a comfort in St. Mary, Mead's minor crises, knelt beside Mr. Baxter, his fingers pressed to the man's wrist. The doctor's face, usually genial, was set in a grim line. He loosened Baxter's collar, his movements swift but precise, and called for water and a blanket. A serving girl, her apron askew, scurried to obey, her footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet. The guests, clustered in uncertain knots, watched with bated breath, their festive mood shattered. Clara Wentworth, the bride, stood frozen, her white dress a stark contrast to her ashen face, her hand gripping Thomas Harwood's arm as if it were a lifeline. Thomas, his jaw tight, stared at the fallen man, his solicitor's composure fraying at the edges. Miss Lavinia Gray, elegant in her green silk, remained near the punch bowl, her expression a mask of detached concern, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her fingers as she adjusted a glove. "Stand back, please," Dr. Haydock said, his voice steady but urgent. "Give him air." The crowd shuffled back, though their eyes remained fixed on the scene. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, murmured a prayer, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. Miss Marple, unobtrusive as ever, leaned slightly toward her neighbor, Mrs. Bantry, whose usual exuberance was subdued. "Such a dreadful thing," Mrs. Bantry whispered, her eyes wide. "He was laughing just a moment ago, wasn't he? So full of life." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts elsewhere. She had seen Mr. Baxter take a hearty bite of the wedding cake, his booming voice praising its flavor. The cake, she recalled, had been the centerpiece of the reception, a triumph of Mr. Percival Reed's artistry. Now it sat on its table, half-carved, its sugar roses glinting innocently in the light. Dr. Haydock's efforts grew more urgent, his brow furrowed as he checked Baxter's eyes and pulse. After a moment, he sat back on his heels, his shoulders sagging. He looked up at the vicar, who hovered nearby, and shook his head. A collective gasp rose from the guests, followed by a low murmur of disbelief. "He's gone," Dr. Haydock said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "I'm afraid there's nothing more to be done." Clara let out a small, choked sob, and Thomas drew her closer, his face pale but resolute. Mr. Reed, the baker, stood near the kitchen door, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes darting from the body to the cake and back again. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him for a moment, noting the beads of sweat on his forehead, despite the coolness of the room. The vicar, Mr. Clement, stepped forward, his voice trembling but kind. "My dear friends, this is a terrible shock. Let us take a moment to pray for Mr. Baxter's soul and for strength in this moment of grief." He bowed his head, and most of the guests followed suit, though Miss Marple's eyes remained open, her mind sifting through the details of the scene. She noted the untouched plates of cake on nearby tables, the scattered crumbs where Baxter had stood, and the faint smear of icing on his fingers. She also observed Lavinia Gray, who had not joined the prayer but stood slightly apart, her gaze fixed on the floor, as if lost in thought. There was something, Miss Marple thought, in the set of her shoulders, a tension that spoke of more than mere shock. The arrival of Inspector Craddock broke the somber hush. A young man with a reputation for thoroughness, he entered the hall with 2 constables, his sharp eyes taking in the scene with practiced efficiency. He conferred briefly with Dr. Haydock, who spoke in low tones, gesturing toward Baxter's body and the remnants of the cake. Craddock's brow furrowed, and he turned to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I must ask you all to remain here for the time being. We'll need to speak with each of you to understand what's happened. Please, try to stay calm." His tone was firm, but not unkind, and the guests, though shaken, nodded in compliance. Dr. Haydock drew Craddock aside, and Miss Marple, with her knack for overhearing what others missed, caught fragments of their conversation. "Aconite, I suspect," the doctor murmured, his voice grave. "The symptoms, convulsions, rapid collapse, are consistent. We'll need a proper analysis, but I'd wager it was in the cake." Craddock's expression darkened, and he glanced at the table where the cake stood, its beauty now a mockery. He gave orders to a constable to secure the cake and any remaining portions, wrapping them carefully for the laboratory. Miss Marple's mind turned to aconite, a poison she knew from her gardening days. It was derived from monkshood, a plant as lovely as it was deadly, and not uncommon in village gardens. But whose garden, she wondered, and whose hand had wielded it? As the constables began to organize the guests, taking names and statements, Miss Marple slipped quietly to the edge of the room, her small figure blending into the shadows. She approached Mr. Reed, who stood alone, his face a picture of distress. "Mr. Reed," she said gently, her voice as soothing as a cup of tea. "What a dreadful thing. Your cake was so admired, and now this." The baker started, then managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I can't understand it. My kitchen is clean as a whistle, my ingredients the best. I've never had so much as a sour loaf, let alone—" His voice trailed off, and he shook his head, his hands trembling. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her eyes noting the faint flour dust on his cuffs and the nervous way he glanced toward the kitchen door. "It must have been a terrible shock," she continued, her tone inviting confidence. "Was the cake in your care the entire time?" Mr. Reed hesitated, then admitted, "Well, I brought it to the hall this morning, set it up myself, but I had to step out to fetch more icing sugar from the shop. Only for 20 minutes or so. The kitchen staff were about, though." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. 20 minutes, she repeated softly. "And the kitchen staff, you say? Anyone could have come and gone, I suppose?" Mr. Reed nodded, his distress deepening. "I suppose so, but who would do such a thing? Poor Mr. Baxter, he was such a jolly sort." Miss Marple murmured agreement, her mind filing away the baker's words. 20 minutes was ample time, she thought, for a determined hand to tamper with a cake. She moved next to Clara and Thomas, who stood near the head table, surrounded by concerned relatives. Clara's eyes were red-rimmed, her veil slightly askew, but she held herself with the dignity of a bride determined not to crumble. Thomas, his arm around her, answered the constable's questions in a low, steady voice. Miss Marple approached, offering a quiet word of condolence. "My dear Clara, what a terrible shadow on your day," she said, her voice warm with sympathy. Clara managed a tremulous smile. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I can't believe it. Mr. Baxter was so kind, so full of cheer. Why would this happen?" Her voice broke, and Thomas tightened his grip on her shoulder. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but she noted the way Clara's gaze darted toward Lavinia, who was now speaking with a constable, her gestures measured and precise. "Thomas," Miss Marple said, turning to the groom, "you knew Mr. Baxter well, didn't you? A business acquaintance, I believe?" Thomas nodded, his expression guarded. "Yes, we had dealings, a property matter. He was a shrewd man, but fair. I can't imagine who'd want to harm him." His tone was even, but Miss Marple detected a slight strain, as if he were choosing his words with care. She smiled gently, her mind turning over the possibilities. A business disagreement, perhaps, or something more personal. She made a mental note to inquire further, but for now, she stepped back, allowing the young couple a moment of privacy. Her attention shifted to Lavinia Gray, who stood apart, her green dress a vivid splash against the muted tones of the hall. Miss Marple approached, her steps slow and deliberate, as if merely stretching her legs. "Miss Gray," she said, her voice light, "what a tragedy to mar such a happy occasion. You must be as shocked as we all are." Lavinia turned, her smile polite but cool. "Indeed, Miss Marple, it's quite dreadful. Poor Mr. Baxter. I hardly knew him, but he seemed a pleasant man." Her words were smooth, but Miss Marple noted the slight pause before she spoke, as if weighing her response. "You were near the punch bowl, I believe?" "When it happened," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. "Such a central spot. One sees everything from there." Lavinia's eyes flickered, but she nodded. "Yes, I suppose so. I was chatting with Mrs. Price, I think, when I heard the commotion." Miss Marple smiled, her mind noting the vagueness of the alibi. Mrs. Price, she recalled, was notoriously forgetful about details. As the constables continued their work, Miss Marple slipped into the kitchen, a small, bustling space now eerily quiet. The counters were cluttered with serving trays and empty bottles, but her eyes fell on a small sideboard near the back door, where a few crumbs of cake remained. She bent closer, her fingers brushing the surface. The door, she noted, led to a narrow alley behind the hall, easily accessible to anyone familiar with the building. A young maid, Elsie, appeared, her face pale. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it awful?" she said, her voice trembling. Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind. "Indeed, Elsie. Were you here all morning, preparing for the reception?" The girl nodded. "Yes, ma'am, but it was so busy. People coming and going, deliveries, guests peeking in. I didn't see anything odd, though." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Anyone near the cake, perhaps, before it was brought out?" Elsie frowned, then said, "Well, I did see a lady in a green dress by the sideboard, but only for a moment. I thought she was just looking." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her tone light. "A green dress, you say? How interesting." Returning to the hall, Miss Marple resumed her seat, her knitting once more in her hands, though her needles remained still. Inspector Craddock was now questioning Mr. Reed, his notebook open, his questions sharp but polite. The guests, released one by one after giving their statements, began to drift away, their faces drawn. Clara and Thomas remained, their wedding day now a memory tainted by death. Miss Marple watched as Lavinia gathered her shawl and left, her movements graceful but hurried. The cake, sealed in bags by the constables, was carried away, its beauty a grim reminder of the tragedy. As the hall emptied, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the poison. Aconite, if Dr. Haydock was correct, was not a casual choice. It required knowledge and access, perhaps even intent to kill. She recalled Lavinia's garden, where monkshood bloomed in vibrant purple spikes. She thought of Mr. Reed's brief absence from the kitchen, of Clara's nervous glance, of Thomas's guarded words. And she thought of Mr. Baxter, a man whose jovial exterior might have masked secrets worth killing for. The joyous occasion had ended in death, and Miss Marple knew, with the quiet certainty that came from years of observing human nature, that the truth lay hidden in the details she had yet to uncover. For now, she picked up her knitting, her needles clicking softly, as she waited for the next thread to unravel. Chapter 3. The Baker's Tale. The morning after the tragedy at the village hall, St. Mary Mead wore a subdued air, as if the very hedgerows whispered of the calamity. The sun, though bright, seemed to cast a paler light over the cobbled streets, and the usual chatter at the grocer's and post office was hushed. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat firmly in place and a basket over her arm, made her way to Mr. Percival Reed's bakery, a quaint shop with a green awning and windows displaying golden loaves. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and the warm scent of yeast and vanilla enveloped her, a stark contrast to the grim purpose of her visit. She had come to speak with the baker, whose wedding cake, so recently the pride of the reception, was now the center of a dark mystery. Mr. Reed stood behind the counter, his apron dusted with flour, his face etched with worry. The shop was empty, save for a single customer, old Mrs. Price, who was examining a tray of scones with her usual indecision. Miss Marple waited patiently, her eyes taking in the neat rows of pastries and the gleaming copper scales, relics of a bygone era. The bakery was a testament to Mr. Reed's meticulous nature, and Miss Marple, who had a knack for noticing such things, observed the spotless surfaces and the precise arrangement of tools. A man so careful, she thought, would hardly be careless with a wedding cake, yet carelessness was not the issue at hand. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," Miss Marple said as Mrs. Price departed with her scones, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "I hope I'm not intruding at such a difficult time." The baker looked up, his eyes heavy with fatigue, and managed a weary smile. "Not at all, Miss Marple. It's kind of you to call. I'm at 6s and 7s, I confess." He gestured to a stool near the counter, and Miss Marple settled herself, her basket at her feet, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "Such a dreadful thing," she said, "to have your beautiful cake caught up in this tragedy. You must be quite shaken." Mr. Reed nodded, wiping his hands on his apron, a gesture that seemed more nervous than necessary. "Shaken doesn't half cover it, Miss Marple. I've been baking for this village nigh on 20 years, christenings, birthdays, weddings, and never a complaint. To think my cake—" His voice faltered, and he shook his head as if to dispel the thought. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright with interest. "Your work is so well regarded," she said. "I recall Mrs. Bantry saying your sponge is the lightest in the county. Tell me, how did you come to make the cake for Clara and Thomas?" The baker's face softened at the mention of his craft. "Miss Wentworth, Clara that is, came to me months ago. Wanted something grand," she said, "but tasteful. 3 tiers, white icing, sugar roses. I worked on it for days, you know, testing recipes, making sure every layer was perfect. I used my best ingredients, fresh eggs from the farm, vanilla from London, none of that cheap stuff." He paused, his brow furrowing. "I can't fathom how it went wrong. The police say poison, aconite, they think, but I swear, Miss Marple, my kitchen's as clean as a vicar's conscience." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers smoothing the edge of her shawl. "I'm sure it is, Mr. Reed. A kitchen like yours doesn't earn such a reputation by chance. But tell me, how was the cake managed once it left your hands? It went to the hall, I presume?" The baker leaned against the counter, his shoulders slumping. I brought it over myself, early yesterday. Set it up in the hall's kitchen, on that big table they use for receptions. I was there most of the morning, icing the final roses, making sure it stood steady. But—" he hesitated, his eyes darting to the window as if expecting an eavesdropper. "But?" Miss Marple prompted, her tone encouraging, as if coaxing a shy child. Mr. Reed sighed. "I had to pop back here for a bit. Ran out of icing sugar, you see. I was gone perhaps half an hour, no more. The kitchen staff were about, and I thought it safe enough. The cake was covered, and the door was locked when I left. But when I got back, well, everything seemed as I'd left it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained benign. "Half an hour," she mused. "And the staff, you say? Were they in the kitchen the whole time?" Mr. Reed frowned, rubbing his chin. "Well, there's young Elsie, the maid, and Mrs. Turner, who does the cooking for big events. They were in and out, fetching things, setting up trays. I didn't see anyone near the cake when I returned, but I suppose someone could have slipped in. The back door's not always locked, you know, with all the comings and goings." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the possibilities. A half-hour window, a busy kitchen, an unlocked door, ample opportunity for a careful hand to tamper if one knew where to look. "Did you notice anything unusual when you returned?" she asked, her voice light, as if the question were an afterthought. Mr. Reed thought for a moment, then shook his head. Nothing out of place, Miss Marple. The cake was just as I'd left it, cover and all. I checked it over before the reception. Habit, you know. I even tasted a bit of the icing myself, to be sure. Sweet as you please, no hint of anything amiss. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. You tasted it yourself, and felt no ill effects? The baker nodded vigorously. Not a twinge. Whatever happened, it wasn't in my kitchen. I'd stake my shop on it. Miss Marple smiled, her mind noting the significance of his words. If the poison was indeed aconite, as Dr. Haydock suspected, it was not something that could be mistaken for sugar or flour. It required deliberate application, likely after the cake had left Mr. Reed's hands. She glanced around the bakery, her eyes lingering on a small shelf of recipe books and a jar of dried herbs, innocuous in their place. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Reed," she said, rising from the stool. "I'm sure the police will clear this up soon. It's such a pity, when your work brought so much joy." As she stepped toward the door, she paused, as if struck by a sudden thought. "Oh, one more thing," she said, turning back. "Did you happen to see Miss Lavinia Gray at the hall yesterday, perhaps near the kitchen? She's so fond of flowers. I thought she might have been admiring the decorations." Mr. Reed's face clouded, and he hesitated before answering. "I don't recall seeing her, Miss Marple, but there were so many people about. She might have been there, I suppose. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's smile was disarming. "No reason at all, just an old woman's curiosity. Good day, Mr. Reed." Outside, the village street was quiet, save for the distant clatter of a milk cart. Miss Marple walked slowly, her basket swinging gently, her thoughts as precise as the stitches in her knitting. Mr. Reed's account was plausible, his distress genuine, yet the half-hour gap nagged at her. She recalled Lavinia Gray's tense posture at the reception, the maid Elsie's mention of a woman in a green dress near the cake. Aconite, she knew, was not a poison one stumbled upon by accident. It grew in gardens, like the one Lavinia tended with such pride. But why poison a cake, and why Mr. Baxter? Was he the intended victim, or had the act been meant to disrupt the wedding itself? Miss Marple's steps took her past the church, where the vicar was tending the rose beds, his face somber. She paused to exchange a few words, noting his mention of Lavinia's recent gift of flowers to the altar. Monkshood among them, he said, their purple blooms striking but ominous in hindsight. "Such a pity," Mr. Clement said, "to think beauty can hide such danger." Miss Marple agreed, her mind turning to the parallels in human nature. Beauty, indeed, could mask malice, and she suspected that the truth of Mr. Baxter's death lay not in the baker's kitchen, but in the tangled motives of those who had gathered to celebrate. As she continued her walk, Miss Marple considered Mr. Reed's role. His reputation was spotless, his distress authentic, yet his absence from the hall provided an opportunity someone had seized. She thought of Clara's nervous glance at Lavinia, of Thomas's guarded tone when speaking of Baxter, and of Lavinia's cool detachment. Each, in their way, held a piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, knew that the truth would emerge, like a pattern in her knitting, one careful stitch at a time. For now, she turned toward the vicarage, where she hoped to find Clara, and perhaps uncover another thread in this intricate and deadly tapestry. Chapter 4. The Bride's Secret. The vicarage garden, a haven of neatly trimmed roses and lavender, offered a quiet respite from the somber mood that had settled over St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat shielding her eyes from the midday sun, sat on a wrought iron bench, her knitting bag at her side. Across from her, Clara Wentworth, still in the simple muslin dress she had worn since her ill-fated wedding day, sipped tea with a trembling hand. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had tactfully withdrawn to the house, leaving the two women alone under the shade of an ancient yew. Miss Marple, with her knack for putting others at ease, smiled gently, her eyes soft but searching. She had come to offer comfort, but also to listen, for she knew that grief often loosened tongues and revealed truths hidden in happier times. "My dear Clara," Miss Marple began, her voice as soothing as the rustle of leaves overhead, "how you must be suffering after such a dreadful shock. To have your wedding day marred so cruelly, it's more than anyone should bear." Clara's eyes, red-rimmed and shadowed, met hers briefly before dropping to the teacup in her lap. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking it's a nightmare, that I'll wake and find Mr. Baxter laughing again, toasting our happiness. But it's real, isn't it? He's gone." Her fingers tightened on the cup, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor, the way Clara's shoulders hunched as if bracing against an unseen weight. "It is real, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. "And yet in such tragedies, there is often a pattern, a thread that leads to the truth. You were so brave yesterday, holding yourself together amidst such chaos." She paused, her needles clicking softly as she drew a strand of wool from her bag, a gesture that seemed to steady the moment. "I couldn't help but notice how many eyes were on you and Thomas, and not all of them kind. Weddings, you know, bring out such curious emotions in people." Clara's head lifted slightly, a flicker of wariness crossing her face. Miss Marple's words were light, but her gaze was steady, inviting confidence without pressing. Clara set her teacup on the table, her movements careful, as if afraid to shatter the fragile calm. "It was such a blur," she said. "Everyone was so happy at first, laughing and dancing. Then Mr. Baxter—" Her voice caught, and she pressed a hand to her lips. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "Of course, it must have been overwhelming. But you've known most of these people all your life, haven't you? You'd notice if someone seemed out of sorts, perhaps." She let the question hang, her eyes never leaving Clara's face. The young woman hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. "I suppose there was one thing," she said at last, her voice low. "Miss Gray, Lavinia, she was there, near the kitchen, before the reception began. I saw her when I went to check on the flowers. She was standing by the sideboard where the cake was kept. I thought she was just looking at the decorations, but—" Clara trailed off, her cheeks flushing. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. "But?" she prompted, her tone as gentle as a nudge. Clara glanced toward the vicarage, as if ensuring they were alone. "It was the way she looked at me," she said, her voice barely audible. "Not angry, exactly, but cold, like she was holding something back. I know she and Thomas were close once, before we were engaged. She never said anything unkind, but I always felt she resented me. Her words came faster now, as if a dam had broken. She was so poised yesterday, smiling at everyone, but when she thought no one was watching, her face changed. I can't explain it, Miss Marple, but it frightened me." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing slightly behind her spectacles. "How very interesting," she said, her voice as calm as ever. And this was before the tragedy, you say? Near the kitchen? Clara nodded, her hands clasped tightly. Yes, just before we all gathered for the toasts. I didn't think much of it then, but after what happened to Mr. Baxter, I keep wondering. She stopped, her eyes wide with sudden realization. Oh, Miss Marple, you don't think Lavinia could have… Her voice trembled, and she left the question unfinished. Miss Marple smiled, a small, reassuring gesture. My dear, we mustn't jump to conclusions. People often act strangely at weddings, especially when old affections are stirred. But it's good to notice these things, to tuck them away, as it were. She resumed her knitting, the soft click of her needles filling the silence. Did you know Mr. Baxter well? She asked, her tone conversational, as if the question were an afterthought. Clara shook her head. Not really. He was a friend of Thomas's, more through business than anything. He was always kind, though, always ready with a laugh. I can't imagine why anyone would want to harm him. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over Clara's words. The mention of Lavinia near the kitchen aligned with Elsie's account of a woman in a green dress, and the coldness Clara described suggested a depth of feeling that went beyond polite rivalry. But there was something else in Clara's manner, a hesitation, a shadow of fear, that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. You and Thomas seem so well suited, she said, her voice warm. It must be a comfort to have him by your side through all this. Clara's smile was fleeting, but genuine. He's been wonderful, Miss Marple, so steady, even now. But I worry. This has cast such a shadow over us. What if people think… She stopped, her cheeks flushing again. Think what, my dear? Miss Marple asked, her tone as gentle as a caress. Clara's eyes dropped to her lap. That it was our fault, somehow. The cake was for our wedding, after all, and Thomas, he and Mr. Baxter had a disagreement recently, over some property deal. It was nothing serious, just business, but people talk, don't they? Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly, though her expression remained serene. People do talk, she agreed, but they often say more about themselves than the truth. A disagreement, you say? Nothing out of the ordinary, I'm sure. Clara nodded, but her fingers twisted her sleeve again, betraying her unease. It was just a matter of land prices, I think. Thomas said Mr. Baxter was stubborn, but they settled it. I don't know the details. Thomas doesn't like to trouble me with his work. Miss Marple smiled, her mind filing away this new piece of information. A business disagreement, however minor, could hold significance, especially when paired with poison. She thought of Thomas's guarded demeanor at the reception, the way his eyes had lingered on Baxter's fallen form. Was it grief or something else? The garden gate creaked, and Mrs. Clement appeared, carrying a tray of fresh scones. I thought you might like a little something, she said, her voice cheerful but strained. Miss Marple thanked her, noting the way Clara's shoulders relaxed at the interruption. The conversation shifted to lighter matters, the weather, the vicarage roses, but Miss Marple's thoughts remained on Clara's words. Lavinia's presence near the cake, her cold glance, the business dispute between Thomas and Baxter. These were threads in a tapestry that was slowly taking shape. She recalled her own niece's wedding, years ago, and the undercurrents of jealousy and ambition that had simmered beneath the smiles. Human nature, she knew, was as predictable as it was complex, and Clara's fear suggested she sensed more than she was willing to say. As they finished their tea, Miss Marple rose, adjusting her hat. "You must rest, my dear," she said to Clara. "This has been a terrible ordeal, but the truth has a way of coming to light. You and Thomas will have your happiness yet." Clara managed a small smile, though her eyes remained troubled. "Thank you, Miss Marple. You're very kind." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch light but reassuring, and took her leave, her basket swinging gently as she walked back through the village. The high street was bustling now, with villagers going about their errands, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Miss Marple paused at the post office, where Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, was quick to share the latest gossip. "They say it was poison, Miss Marple," she whispered, her eyes wide. "In the cake, of all things. Poor Mr. Reed must be beside himself." Miss Marple nodded, her expression grave. "A terrible thing," she agreed. "Did you happen to see anyone at the hall yesterday, before the reception? Miss Gray, perhaps, with her lovely flowers." Miss Weatherby frowned, then brightened. "Why, yes, I saw her there, arranging some bouquets for the tables. She was in and out of the kitchen, I think, though I didn't pay much mind." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind adding another piece to the puzzle. As she walked home, the sun dipping low over the rooftops, Miss Marple considered Clara's account, the bride's fear, her mention of Lavinia's coldness, and the hint of a business dispute with Baxter suggested motives that went beyond a simple act of malice. Lavinia's presence near the cake was no coincidence, but was she the only one with opportunity? And what of Clara herself, whose nervousness seemed to hide a deeper worry? Miss Marple thought of her old friend Mrs. Latimer, whose daughter had once concealed a small scandal out of love for her fiancé. Loyalty, she knew, could make one silent even in the face of suspicion. With each step, the threads of the mystery tightened, and Miss Marple, her eyes bright with purpose, knew that her next conversation might unravel another knot in this deadly affair. Chapter 5. The Groom's Burden. The afternoon light filtered through the leaded windows of Thomas Harwood's study, casting a lattice of shadows across the polished oak desk where he sat, his head bowed over a ledger. The room, lined with leather-bound books and a faint scent of pipe tobacco, was a sanctuary of order, reflecting the solicitor's meticulous nature. Miss Jane Marple, admitted by a nervous housemaid, stood quietly in the doorway, her small figure framed by the heavy drapes. She had walked from the vicarage, her steps measured, her mind turning over the threads of the tragedy that had struck Clara and Thomas's wedding. Her visit was ostensibly one of condolence, but her sharp eyes, hidden behind a gentle smile, sought answers in the groom's demeanor. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call," Thomas said, rising with a courtesy that seemed to cost him effort. His face, handsome in its angular way, bore the strain of sleeplessness, and his tie was slightly askew, a small but telling departure from his usual precision. He gestured to a chair opposite the desk, and Miss Marple settled into it, her knitting bag at her side, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Thomas," she said, her voice as soft as the rustle of her shawl. "I felt I must see how you and Clara are bearing up after such a dreadful event." Thomas's smile was tight, more a reflex than a reflection of ease. "We're managing, Miss Marple, though it's been a blow. Clara's resting at the vicarage. Mrs. Clement's been a godsend. I came here to keep busy, I suppose." He gestured vaguely at the ledger, but his eyes, Miss Marple noted, avoided hers, lingering instead on a small silver inkstand. She nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy. Work can be a comfort, she said, though it's hard to escape such a shadow. Poor Mr. Baxter, such a lively man, gone so suddenly. Yes, a terrible thing, Thomas said, his voice low. He sat back, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk, a rhythm that betrayed unease. Miss Marple's needles appeared, as if by habit, and she began to knit, the soft click a counterpoint to the silence that followed. You knew him well, I believe, she said, her tone conversational, as if merely filling the quiet. Through your work, wasn't it? Clara mentioned something about a property matter. Thomas's fingers stilled, and he looked up, his gaze sharpening for a moment, before softening into something like resignation. Yes, George, Mr. Baxter, was a client, he said, choosing his words with care. We handled a few transactions together, land mostly. He had a knack for spotting good investments, though he could be stubborn at times. He paused, his jaw tightening. We had a disagreement recently, nothing out of the ordinary in business, just a matter of terms on a parcel of land near the river. He wanted a lower price than the seller would accept, and I was caught in the middle. It was resolved, though. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her eyes on her work, though her mind was fixed on Thomas's tone. Resolved, you say? That's good. Business can be so trying, can't it? All those details to manage. Thomas nodded, but his eyes flickered to the window, where the garden lay quiet under the afternoon sun. It can, he said. George was a good sort, really. Always ready with a joke, even when we didn't see eye to eye. I can't fathom why anyone would. He trailed off, his hands clenching briefly before relaxing. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. Why anyone would harm him, she finished gently. It's a puzzle, isn't it? Poison in a wedding cake, such a public act. Almost as if someone wanted to make a statement, don't you think? Thomas's gaze snapped back to her, and for a moment she saw a flash of something. Alarm, perhaps, or calculation in his eyes. A statement? He repeated, his voice steady but with an edge. I suppose it could be seen that way, but it's more likely some horrible mistake, isn't it? Something in the ingredients, perhaps. Miss Marple's smile was serene, though her mind noted the deflection. Perhaps, she said, though Dr. Haydock seems to think it was aconite, and that's not something one finds in a baker's pantry. It's more deliberate, wouldn't you say? Thomas leaned back, his fingers resuming their drumming. I wouldn't know about poisons, he said, a touch too quickly. I leave that sort of thing to gardeners and chemists. All I know is that it's ruined our wedding, and Clara's heartbroken. His voice softened at Clara's name, and Miss Marple observed the genuine warmth in his expression. Whatever his secrets, she thought, his affection for his bride seemed real. Poor Clara, she said. She mentioned seeing Miss Gray near the kitchen before the reception. Did you notice her there by any chance? She's so fond of arranging things, I hear. Thomas frowned, his brow creasing as if trying to recall. Lavinia? I don't think so. I was busy with guests, making sure everything was in order. She might have been about, but I didn't see her near the cake. His tone was even, but Miss Marple noted the slight hesitation, the way his eyes flicked to the side before returning to her. She and Clara have a bit of history, don't they? She said, her voice light as if gossiping over tea. Old rivalries, perhaps. Weddings do bring such things to the surface. Thomas's laugh was short, almost brittle. Rivalries. I suppose you could call it that. Lavinia and I were friends once, before Clara. She took it hard when I proposed, but that was ages ago. She's been nothing but civil since." He paused, then added, "She's not the sort to hold a grudge, Miss Marple. She's too sophisticated for that." Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving faster now, as if keeping pace with her thoughts. "Sophistication," she said, "can be such a marvelous mask, can't it? Like a well-cut dress, it hides all sorts of imperfections." The room fell silent, save for the ticking of a clock on the mantel. Thomas shifted in his chair, his fingers now still, as if aware of their earlier betrayal. Miss Marple, sensing the moment to press gently, leaned forward slightly. "You must have been near the cake yourself at some point," she said, her tone as casual as if discussing the weather. "Did you notice anything odd? A smell, perhaps, or someone lingering where they shouldn't?" Thomas shook his head, his expression firm. "Nothing, Miss Marple. I was with Clara or the guests the whole time. The cake was Mr. Reed's domain. I didn't go near it until the cutting." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with apparent warmth. "Of course, you had so much to attend to. A groom's duties are endless, aren't they?" She paused, then added, as if an afterthought, "Mr. Baxter's death must have been a shock, especially given your recent dealings. Did he seem himself yesterday, before?" Thomas's face tightened, and for a moment she thought he might deflect again. But he sighed, his shoulders slumping. He was his usual self, loud, cheerful, a bit overbearing. He even teased me about the land deal, said I'd driven a hard bargain. It was all in good fun, though. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. A tease about a business deal, however light, could mask deeper tensions. She thought of her nephew, Raymond, whose business disputes had once led to heated words over dinner, words that lingered long after the meal. "Good fun," she repeated softly. "It's strange, isn't it, how such moments can seem so ordinary until they're not?" Thomas met her gaze, his expression unreadable, and she sensed a wall going up, a barrier she would not breach today. Rising from her chair, Miss Marple adjusted her shawl. "I mustn't keep you, Thomas," she said. "You've been most kind to indulge an old woman's chatter. Do give Clara my love, and tell her to rest." Thomas stood, his courtesy returning as he showed her to the door. "Thank you, Miss Marple," he said. "Your concern means a great deal." As she stepped into the garden, the air cool with the promise of evening, Miss Marple glanced back, noting the way Thomas lingered in the doorway, his eyes distant. The walk back to her cottage was slow, her steps measured as she turned over the conversation. Thomas's guarded manner, his quick dismissal of Lavinia's motives, and his mention of the business dispute with Baxter formed a pattern, though not yet clear. She recalled Clara's nervousness, the maid Elsie's sighting of a woman in green, and Mr. Reed's absence from the kitchen. Thomas, she thought, was a man accustomed to control, yet something in his demeanor suggested a burden he was not ready to share. Was it guilt, fear, or merely the weight of a ruined wedding? She thought of Lavinia, whose sophistication, as Thomas put it, might indeed mask a deeper resentment. And Baxter himself, what secrets had he carried that a bite of cake had silenced forever? As she passed the church, Miss Marple paused, her eyes drawn to the monk's hood blooming in a nearby garden, its purple spikes vivid against the green. Aconite, she knew, was no accident, and its presence pointed to someone with knowledge and intent. Thomas's study, with its order and restraint, had revealed more than he intended. and Miss Marple, her knitting bag swinging gently, felt the threads of the mystery drawing tighter. She would need to speak to Lavinia next, to test the strength of that sophisticated mask, and to see what truths lay beneath. Chapter 6. The Rival's Mask. The late afternoon sun draped St. Mary Mead in a soft golden haze, softening the edges of the village's thatched roofs and cobblestone paths. Miss Jane Marple, her steps light despite the weight of her thoughts, made her way to Rose Cottage, the elegant home of Miss Lavinia Gray. The cottage, with its climbing roses and neatly trimmed lawn, stood at the edge of the village, a picture of refined charm that matched its occupant. Miss Marple had telephoned earlier, and Lavinia had invited her for tea with a courtesy that seemed almost too polished. As she knocked on the polished oak door, Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her eyes bright with the quiet alertness that had served her so well in unraveling human mysteries. Lavinia greeted her with a smile, her green silk dress exchanged for a simple but elegant frock of pale blue, her dark hair swept back in a chignon that spoke of careful attention. "Miss Marple, how delightful," she said, her voice smooth as the porcelain teapot she later set on the table. "Please, do come in. I'm so glad for a bit of company amidst all this dreadful business." The drawing-room was a study in tasteful restraint, chintz curtains, a vase of fresh dahlias, and a low table set with delicate cups. Miss Marple settled into a cushioned chair, her knitting bag at her feet, her expression one of benign interest. "You're very kind to have me, Miss Gray," she said. "It's such a trying time for the village, and I thought a quiet chat might do us both good." Lavinia poured the tea, her movements graceful but precise, as if each gesture were calculated. "Trying is an understatement," she said, her tone light but with a faint edge. "Poor Mr. Baxter, and on Clara and Thomas's day of all times. It's quite shattered the village's peace." Miss Marple nodded, accepting a cup with a murmur of thanks. "Indeed," she said, "a wedding should be a moment of joy, not tragedy. You were there, of course, looking so elegant in your green dress. I couldn't help but notice you near the punch bowl, such a central spot." Her voice was gentle, but her eyes, behind their spectacles, watched Lavinia closely. Lavinia's hand paused briefly as she passed a plate of biscuits, but her smile remained intact. "Why, yes, I suppose I was," she said. "It's a good place to see everyone, isn't it? I was chatting with Mrs. Price and some others, enjoying the festivities." Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles appearing as if by habit, their soft click filling the pause. "Mrs. Price? Yes," she said. "Such a dear woman, though her memory isn't what it was. And you were near the kitchen earlier, I believe. Clara mentioned seeing you there, perhaps admiring the decorations." Her tone was as casual as if discussing the weather, but her words carried a gentle probe. Lavinia's eyes flickered, a momentary tightening at their corners, but her composure held. "The kitchen?" she said, her laugh light but slightly forced. "Oh, I may have popped in to see the flowers I'd arranged for the tables. Clara's so particular about such things, and I wanted to be sure they were just right." She sipped her tea, her gaze steady now, though Miss Marple noted the careful way she held the cup, as if to steady her hands. "It's such a pity," Lavinia continued, "that Mr. Reed's lovely cake was ruined by this accident. I can't imagine how it happened." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her expression one of mild surprise. "An accident, you think? Dr. Haydock seems certain it was aconite, and that's rather specific, isn't it? Not something one finds in a sugar jar." Lavinia's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly, setting her cup down with a delicate clink. "Aconite? How dreadful," she said. "I know it from gardening, of course. Monkshood is so striking, but I've always been careful with it. Surely no one in St. Mary Mead would use such a thing deliberately." Her voice was smooth, but Miss Marple detected a note of defensiveness, like a seamstress hiding a poorly stitched seam. "Gardening is such a passion of yours," Miss Marple said, her tone warm. "Your monkshood is quite the talk of the village. Those purple blooms are so distinctive. I saw them at the church, part of your generous gift." Lavinia's smile tightened, and she inclined her head. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I do love my garden. It's a solace, especially in times like these." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the ease with which Lavinia deflected the conversation. "A solace, indeed," she said, "though it must be hard, with all this talk of poison, to have such plants in one's garden. People do jump to conclusions, don't they?" Lavinia's laugh was a touch too bright. "They do, don't they? The village is buzzing with theories, I'm sure. But I can't imagine anyone here doing such a thing. Poor Mr. Reed must be devastated, and Clara, well, she's had her day ruined." Her tone softened, but Miss Marple caught the faint undercurrent of satisfaction, so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by a less observant ear. "Clara's bearing up bravely," Miss Marple said. "She mentioned you and Thomas were once close. It must be bittersweet, seeing him so happy with her." Lavinia's eyes narrowed slightly, but her smile held. "Bittersweet? Oh, not at all, Miss Marple. Thomas and I were friends, nothing more. I'm delighted for them, truly." She leaned forward, offering more tea, her movements a shade too deliberate. Miss Marple declined with a wave of her hand, her needles pausing as she met Lavinia's gaze. "Of course," she said, "though old friendships can leave such lingering feelings, can't they? Like a rose that's lost its bloom, but still pricks if you're not careful." Lavinia's expression froze for a fraction of a second, and Miss Marple knew she had touched a nerve, however lightly. The conversation turned to village matters, the flower show, the vicar's latest sermon, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. She thought of Clara's account of Lavinia's cold glance, Elsie's mention of a woman in green near the cake, and Thomas's guarded dismissal of their past. Lavinia's composure, she sensed, was a carefully crafted facade, like the icing on Mr. Reed's cake, beautiful but concealing what lay beneath. "You must have seen so much at the reception," Miss Marple said, her tone casual. "Did you notice Mr. Baxter, perhaps, before the tragedy? He was such a presence, wasn't he?" Lavinia's fingers smoothed her skirt, a small, controlled gesture. "Mr. Baxter? Oh, yes, he was quite the character, always laughing, always the center of attention. I saw him with Thomas early on, joking about something. Business, I think. I didn't pay much mind." She shrugged, but Miss Marple noted the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes avoided direct contact. "Business," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Yes, Thomas mentioned a property deal. It's curious, isn't it, how such matters can stir up feelings, even among friends." Lavinia's smile was a touch cooler now. "Curious, yes," she said, "but I'm sure it was nothing serious. Mr. Baxter seemed in high spirits, right up until—" She paused, her expression softening into one of practiced sorrow. "Such a loss. I do hope the police find out what happened soon." Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "They will, I'm sure," she said. "Inspector Craddock is very thorough, though sometimes it's the small things, where someone stood, what they saw, that make all the difference. As the clock on the mantel chimed, Miss Marple rose, thanking Lavinia for her hospitality. "You've been so gracious, Miss Grey," she said, her smile warm. "I mustn't keep you from your garden. It's such a credit to you." Lavinia escorted her to the door, her courtesy impeccable, but Miss Marple felt the weight of her gaze as she stepped into the garden path. The monk's hood, vibrant and deadly, nodded in the breeze, and Miss Marple paused to admire it, her mind turning over Lavinia's words. The woman's poise was formidable, but there were cracks. Her vague alibi, her quick deflection of Thomas's past, her subtle satisfaction at Clara's distress. Walking back through the village, Miss Marple passed the grocer's, where Mr. Elliot was sweeping the step. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he called. "Terrible business at the wedding, eh? They say it was poison. Makes you think twice about a slice of cake." Miss Marple smiled, pausing to exchange a word. "Terrible, indeed," she said. "Did you happen to see Miss Grey at the hall before the reception? She's so good with flowers." Mr. Elliot scratched his head. "Come to think of it, I did see her there, carrying a basket of blooms. She was in and out of the kitchen, I reckon, setting things up." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind adding another thread to the pattern. Lavinia's mask, she thought, was as carefully crafted as her garden, but it was not impenetrable. The mentions of her presence near the cake, her knowledge of aconite, and her carefully veiled resentment toward Clara pointed to a motive that went beyond mere rivalry. Yet Miss Marple wondered about Mr. Baxter. Why him? Was he a target or a tragic accident in a scheme meant to ruin Clara's day? She thought of her old friend, Miss Hartnell, whose jealousy over a lost suitor had once led to sharp words at a church fete. Lavinia, she suspected, was capable of more than words. As she reached her cottage, the evening light casting long shadows, Miss Marple knew her next step would be to test the strength of those threads, perhaps with Inspector Craddock's help, to see where they led. Chapter 7. A Clue in the Crumbs. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, veiling the village in a delicate shroud that softened the outlines of its cottages and lanes. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn close against the damp, walked briskly toward the village hall, her basket swinging lightly at her side. The hall, so recently a scene of celebration and then tragedy, stood quiet now, its windows dark, its doors locked. Inspector Craddock had agreed to meet her there, his curiosity piqued by her gentle insistence that she might notice something useful. Miss Marple, with her unassuming air, had a way of making such requests seem perfectly reasonable, and Craddock, who had learned to trust her instincts, was eager to hear her thoughts. As she approached, the inspector was waiting by the entrance, his notebook tucked under his arm, his expression a mix of professional reserve and faint amusement. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "I must say, you're up early for a sleuthing expedition. What's brought you back here?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, though her smile was demure. "Oh, Inspector, just an old woman's fancy," she said. "I find that revisiting a place can jog the memory, and sometimes the smallest detail, a crumb, perhaps, can tell a story." Craddock chuckled, unlocking the door. "Well, let's see what stories this hall has to tell, then." Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying a faint echo of the previous day's chaos. The tables, stripped of their festive cloths, stood bare, and the floor had been swept, though not thoroughly. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the glint of a stray sequin from a guest's dress, a reminder of the celebration that had ended so abruptly. Craddock led her to the kitchen, where the sideboard, now empty, had once held Mr. Reed's ill-fated cake. "We've sent the cake to the lab," Craddock said, his tone brisk. "The preliminary report came in this morning. Aconite, as Dr. Haydock suspected. Enough to kill a man in minutes, and it was concentrated in the top tier, where Baxter took his slice." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze sweeping the room. The kitchen was small but well equipped, with a large sink, a gas stove, and shelves lined with crockery. The back door, leading to a narrow alley, stood slightly ajar, as if someone had forgotten to latch it. "Aconite," she murmured, her voice thoughtful. "Such a specific choice, Inspector. It's not something one finds in a kitchen, but in a garden, perhaps." She moved to the sideboard, her fingers brushing the worn wood where the cake had rested. "This is where Mr. Reed set it up, isn't it? He mentioned leaving it for half an hour while he fetched icing sugar." Craddock nodded, flipping open his notebook. "That's right. He claims the cake was covered, and the staff, Elsie and Mrs. Turner, were about, but it's a busy place during a reception. Anyone could have slipped in." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the back door, then moved to a small pile of crumbs on the floor, overlooked by the cleaners. She bent down, her movements surprisingly agile for her age, and picked up a crumb with a delicate touch. "Curious," she said, holding it to the light. "It's from the cake, I presume, but it's oddly gritty. Not quite the texture one expects from Mr. Reed's." Work Craddock raised an eyebrow, peering at the crumb. "Gritty? Could be from the floor, perhaps?" Miss Marple shook her head, her expression intent. "No, Inspector, it's mixed in, as if something was added to the icing. Aconite, in its powdered form, might leave such a trace, mightn't it?" She tucked the crumb into a small envelope from her basket, her movements precise. Craddock's amusement faded, replaced by a flicker of respect. "You think someone sprinkled it on after the cake was set here?" he asked. Miss Marple's smile was faint. "It's possible, don't you think? A quick hand, a moment's privacy, and the deed is done." They moved to the back door, which opened onto a narrow alley lined with bins and overgrown nettles. Miss Marple stepped outside, her eyes scanning the ground. "This door was unlocked," Mr. Reed said, she remarked, "and Elsie mentioned seeing a woman in a green dress near the sideboard. Miss Gray, perhaps?" Craddock's expression sharpened. "Lavinia Gray. She's been mentioned more than once. Clara saw her near the kitchen, and now Elsie. But her alibi's vague, chatting with Mrs. Price, who can't remember what day it is, let alone who she spoke to." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze fixed on a patch of trampled grass just beyond the door. "Miss Gray has a fine garden, Inspector," she said. "Monkshood grows there. I've seen it myself. Such a beautiful plant, but deadly if you know how to use it." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "And she would know, I think. She's not one to miss a detail." Craddock scribbled in his notebook, his brow furrowed. "Motive, though," he said. "Jealousy over Thomas Harwood? Seems a stretch to poison a cake just to spoil a wedding." Miss Marple's needles appeared, though she did not knit, merely holding them as if to anchor her thoughts. "Jealousy, Inspector, is a powerful thing," she said. "But there may be more. Clara mentioned a business disagreement between Thomas and Mr. Baxter, and Lavinia spoke of seeing them together, joking about it. What if Baxter knew something that made him a threat?" Craddock's eyes narrowed. You think he was the target, not just a victim of chance? Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. I think, Inspector, that poison is rarely random. It's a weapon of intent, and we must find the intent behind it. They returned to the kitchen, where Miss Marple's attention fell on a small window above the sink, its latch loose. This window, she said. It's low enough for someone to reach through, isn't it? If the door was watched, a clever person might have used it. Craddock tested the latch, which gave easily. Possible, he conceded, but it would take nerve and knowledge of the hall's layout. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to Lavinia's frequent visits to the hall for flower arrangements, her familiarity with its nooks and crannies. As they left the kitchen, Miss Marple paused by a table in the main hall, where a few forgotten items, a handkerchief, a hairpin, lay scattered. She picked up the hairpin, its green enamel catching the light. "How pretty," she said, turning it over. "Miss Gray wore something like this, didn't she?" Craddock's eyes widened. "You've got a memory like a steel trap, Miss Marple. I'll have it checked, see if it's hers." Miss Marple handed it over, her expression serene, but her mind racing. A hairpin was a small thing, easily dropped, but its presence near the kitchen door was suggestive, like a stitch out of place in a careful pattern. Outside, the mist had lifted, and the village was stirring. Miss Marple declined Craddock's offer of a lift, preferring to walk. "The air clears the mind," she said, her smile disarming. As she made her way home, she stopped at the churchyard, where the vicar was pruning roses. "Good morning, Mr. Clement," she said. "Your monkshood is thriving, I see." The vicar nodded, his face somber. "A gift from Miss Gray," he said. "She's so generous with her flowers, though I confess I'm uneasy about them now." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the purple blooms, their beauty a stark contrast to their danger. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting in her lap. The crumb, the hairpin, the open window, these were clues, small but significant, pointing to a deliberate act. Lavinia's presence near the cake, her knowledge of aconite, and her cool detachment at the reception formed a pattern, but it was not complete. She thought of Thomas's guarded mention of his business with Baxter, Clara's fear, and the possibility that Baxter's death was no accident. Miss Marple recalled her old friend Mrs. Eldridge, whose garden had once concealed a secret that only careful observation revealed. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden in the details she had yet to fully unravel. With a quiet resolve, she picked up her needles, ready to weave the next thread of the mystery. Chapter 8. The Village Whispers. The high street of St. Mary Mead, bathed in the soft glow of a late summer afternoon, hummed with the quiet rhythm of village life. Shopkeepers swept their steps, children darted through the lanes, and the scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the faint tang of chimney smoke. Yet beneath this ordinary bustle, a current of unease ran through the village, as whispers of the poisoned wedding cake spread like ripples on a pond. Miss Jane Marple, her basket over her arm and her hat firmly pinned, walked with her usual unhurried gait, her eyes bright with purpose. She had spent the morning reflecting on her visit to the village hall, the gritty crumb and the green enamel hairpin now vivid in her memory. Today she intended to listen to the village itself, for she knew that gossip, like a stray thread, could lead to the heart of a mystery. Her first stop was the post office, where Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, presided over a counter cluttered with stamps and parcels. The small room was a hub of village chatter, and Miss Weatherby, with her sharp nose for news, was its unofficial chronicler. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," she said, her eyes gleaming with curiosity as she sorted letters. "Terrible business at the wedding, isn't it? Poison, they say, and in Mr. Reed's cake. I'd never have thought it possible." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle concern. "Terrible, indeed," she said, setting her basket on the counter. "It's shaken us all. Have you heard anything new, Miss Weatherby? People do talk, and you hear so much here." Miss Weatherby leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, I do, Miss Marple. Just this morning, Mrs. Elliot was in, saying she saw Miss Gray buying a gardening book at the bookshop last week. All about plants and their uses, she said, though I don't know if it's true. And then there's Mr. Baxter. Folk are saying he had a falling out with Mr. Harwood over some land deal. Not that I believe half of it, mind you." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly, though her smile remained serene. "A gardening book?" she said. "How interesting. Miss Gray's garden is so admired, isn't it? Though I suppose one must be careful with certain plants." Miss Weatherby nodded vigorously, her hands pausing over a stack of envelopes. "That's what I said. Those monkshood flowers of hers, pretty as you please, but deadly, they say. And she was at the hall before the reception, arranging flowers, so Mrs. Price told me, though her memory's not what it was." Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind filing away the confirmation of Lavinia's presence at the hall. "Mrs. Price is such a dear," she said. "But yes, her memory does wander. Did anyone else mention seeing Miss Gray there, perhaps near the kitchen?" The postmistress frowned, tapping her chin. "Now you mention it. Young Tommy from the grocer's said he saw her coming out of the alley by the hall, carrying a basket. Thought she was fetching more flowers, but he wasn't sure." "Oh, Miss Marple, you don't think—" She trailed off, her eyes wide with the thrill of speculation. Miss Marple's smile was disarming. "I don't think anything yet, Miss Weatherby, but it's good to know what's being said. The truth often hides in the chatter, doesn't it?" She purchased a stamp, thanked the postmistress, and stepped back into the street, her thoughts turning over the new information. Her next stop was the grocer's, where Mr. Elliot was stacking tins of biscuits, his apron streaked with flour. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he called, his voice hearty but tinged with unease. "What a to-do about that wedding. Poor Mr. Reed's beside himself, and no wonder." Miss Marple nodded, selecting a small packet of tea from the shelf. "Poor man," she said. "His reputation's taken such a knock. Did you happen to see anything unusual at the hall that day, Mr. Elliot? You're so often about, delivering goods." The grocer paused, wiping his hands on his apron. "Well, now you ask. I did see Miss Gray there, early on. She was carrying a basket, like she always does for her flowers. Came out of the alley near the kitchen door. I thought nothing of it. She's always fussing with decorations." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained mild. "The alley, you say? That's curious. And no one else caught your eye? Mr. Baxter, perhaps, or Mr. Harwood?" Mr. Elliot scratched his head, his brow furrowing. "Can't say I saw Mr. Harwood, but Mr. Baxter was there, talking to someone outside the hall before the guests arrived. Couldn't see who, mind you. It was round the corner. He looked a bit put out, though, not his usual cheery self." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind noting the detail. Baxter upset before the reception, speaking to an unseen figure. another thread to weave into the pattern. As she left the grocer's, Miss Marple's steps took her toward the vicarage, where she found Clara sitting alone in the garden, a book unopened in her lap. The young woman's face, pale and drawn, lit up slightly at the sight of her visitor. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," she said, rising to offer a chair. Miss Marple settled beside her, her basket at her feet, her voice warm with sympathy. "I thought you might need a bit of company, my dear," she said. "The village is full of talk, and it's hard to escape it." Clara's eyes clouded, and she nodded. "It's awful," she said. "People are saying such things, about the cake, about Thomas, even about me. I can't bear it." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch light but reassuring. "Gossip is a cruel thing," she said, "but it often carries a grain of truth. Have you heard anything that troubles you, Clara? Something that might help make sense of this?" Clara hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her book. "There's something I didn't mention before," she said at last, her voice low. "Mr. Baxter, he once told me he knew something about Lavinia, something from her past. He laughed about it, said it was an old scandal, but I think it upset her. I saw them talking at the reception, and she looked angry. I didn't think much of it then. But now—" Her voice trailed off, and she looked at Miss Marple with wide, fearful eyes. Miss Marple's needles appeared, though she did not knit, merely holding them as if to steady her thoughts. "An old scandal," she repeated softly. "How very interesting. Did he say what it was?" Clara shook her head. "No, he was teasing, as he often did, but Lavinia's face, it was like a storm cloud. I think she was afraid he'd say more." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over this new piece of the puzzle. A scandal, real or imagined, could be a powerful motive, especially for someone as poised as Lavinia, whose reputation was as carefully tended as her garden. As they spoke, the vicar emerged from the house, his face somber but kind. "Miss Marple, Clara, I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, joining them. "The village is still reeling, I'm afraid. I've just had Mrs. Bantry in, full of theories about the poison." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Mrs. Bantry does love a good story," she said. "Did she have anything particular to say?" The vicar sighed, settling onto a bench. "Only that she saw Miss Grey at the hall early, arranging flowers, and thought she seemed preoccupied. And she mentioned Mr. Baxter's business dealings, said he'd been boasting about a deal that didn't go as planned, though she didn't know the details." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly now, her mind weaving the threads together. Lavinia's presence at the hall, confirmed by multiple voices, Baxter's knowledge of a scandal, his disagreement with Thomas, the gritty crumb and the hairpin near the kitchen door. Each was a piece of the pattern, and she sensed it was close to forming a picture. "Thank you, Mr. Clement," she said, rising. "You've been most helpful. Clara, my dear, try to rest. The truth has a way of coming out." Clara managed a small smile, though her eyes remained troubled. As Miss Marple walked home, the village settling into the quiet of evening, she thought of her old friend Mrs. Carstairs, whose gossip had once revealed a hidden truth about a neighbor's grudge. The whispers of St. Mary Mead, she knew, were not just idle chatter. They were the pulse of the village, carrying hints of motive and opportunity. Lavinia's garden, Baxter's secrets, Thomas's guardedness, and Clara's fear, all pointed to a deliberate act, one meant to strike at more than just a wedding. Miss Marple's steps slowed as she reached her cottage, her mind alight with the next step, to test these whispers against the evidence, and to see if Lavinia's mask would crack under the weight of scrutiny. Chapter 9. The Confrontation. The drawing room of the vicarage glowed softly in the lamplight, its chintz curtains drawn against the gathering dusk of St. Mary Mead. A small fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the faces of the gathered company. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles poised but still. Inspector Craddock, his notebook open, his expression alert. Clara Wentworth, pale but composed beside Thomas Harwood, whose steady gaze belied a faint tension in his jaw. And Miss Lavinia Gray, her elegant frame poised in a high-backed chair, her smile as polished as the silver teapot on the table. The vicar and his wife had tactfully withdrawn, leaving Miss Marple to orchestrate what she hoped would be a pivotal moment in unraveling the mystery of Mr. Baxter's death. Miss Marple had suggested this gathering, her voice mild, as she proposed a little chat to clear the air. Inspector Craddock, accustomed to her methods, had agreed, sensing that her quiet persistence often yielded results where formal interrogations faltered. The room, though cozy, held an undercurrent of unease, as if each occupant sensed the weight of what was to come. Miss Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, began with her usual disarming courtesy. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her eyes moving from face to face. "It's such a sad business, this tragedy at Clara and Thomas's wedding, and I thought we might put our heads together to make sense of it. The village is so full of talk, you know, and sometimes a quiet word can set things right." Clara nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Thomas offered a tight smile, his fingers brushing hers in a gesture of reassurance. Lavinia's expression remained serene, though Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her lips, a subtle sign of wariness. Inspector Craddock leaned forward, his pen poised. "Miss Marple's right," he said. "We've got some pieces of the puzzle, but they don't quite fit yet. The lab confirmed aconite in the cake's top tier, where Mr. Baxter took his slice. It's a deliberate act, no mistake. What we need is clarity on who had the chance and the reason to do it." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythm that seemed to steady the room. "Aconite is such a curious choice," she said, her voice thoughtful. "It's not something one finds by accident, is it? It grows in gardens, lovely to look at but deadly if misused. I couldn't help but think of your monkshood, Miss Gray, so admired in the village." She spoke lightly, as if admiring a neighbor's roses, but her eyes were fixed on Lavinia, who met her gaze with a cool smile. "My monkshood?" Lavinia said, her tone smooth. "Yes, it's quite striking. But surely you don't think I'd tamper with a cake, Miss Marple. I'm a gardener, not a poisoner." The room grew still, the crackle of the fire suddenly loud. Clara's eyes widened, and Thomas shifted in his seat, his hand tightening on Clara's. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but unwavering. "Of course not, Miss Gray," she said. "But it's interesting, isn't it? How many people saw you near the kitchen before the reception? Clara noticed you by the sideboard, and young Elsie mentioned a woman in a green dress. Your dress, I believe. Even Mr. Elliot saw you in the alley carrying your basket." Lavinia's smile faltered, though she quickly recovered, her laugh light but strained. "The alley? The kitchen? My dear Miss Marple, I was arranging flowers, as I often do. The hall was bustling. Surely others were about as well." Inspector Craddock flipped a page in his notebook. "That's true," he said, his voice even. "But your alibi's a bit thin, Miss Gray. Mrs. Price can't recall who she spoke to, and no one else. Places you with the guests at the time the cake was left unattended. Mr. Reed was away for half an hour, and that back door was unlocked." Lavinia's eyes flickered, but she maintained her composure, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Inspector," she said. "I had no reason to harm anyone, least of all Mr. Baxter. I barely knew him." Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles pausing. "Barely knew him, perhaps," she said. "But he knew you, didn't he? Clara mentioned a conversation where Mr. Baxter hinted at an old scandal, something about your family. He was teasing," she said, "but you seemed upset. And Thomas saw you speaking with him at the reception, didn't you, Thomas?" Thomas started, his face tightening. Yes, I saw them talking," he said, his voice careful. "It looked like a friendly chat, nothing more." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her gaze remained sharp. "Friendly, perhaps," she said. "But Mr. Baxter had a way of stirring things up, didn't he? That business deal with you, Thomas, a disagreement over land prices. He teased you about it, too, just before he died." Thomas's jaw clenched, and Clara's hand gripped his more tightly. "It was nothing," Thomas said, his tone firm. "A minor dispute, settled weeks ago. Baxter was joking, that's all." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. "Of course," she said. "But it's curious, isn't it? How these small things, teases, disagreements, can linger in the mind. And then there's the hairpin, Inspector, the green enamel one found near the kitchen door. So like the one you wore, Miss Gray." Lavinia's composure cracked, her eyes narrowing. "A hairpin?" she said, her voice sharp. "There must be dozens like it in the village. You can't seriously think—" She stopped, her hands clenching briefly before smoothing her skirt. Craddock leaned forward, his tone measured. "We're checking it, Miss Gray, but it's suggestive, especially with the crumbs we found. Gritty, as if something was sprinkled on the icing. Aconite, perhaps, applied quickly through that open window or by the sideboard." Lavinia's face paled, but she held her ground, her smile returning, though it was brittle now. "This is absurd," she said. "I arranged flowers. I mingled with guests. I had no reason to do such a thing." Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, a steady counterpoint to the tension in the room. "No reason," she said softly. "But there's Clara's happiness, isn't there? You and Thomas were close once, Miss Gray, and it's only human to feel a pang when someone else takes your place. And Mr. Baxter, with his careless talk of scandals, perhaps he knew something that threatened your standing in the village. A poisoned cake would ruin Clara's day and silence him, wouldn't it?" Her voice was gentle, almost sorrowful, but her words cut like a needle through fabric. Lavinia stood abruptly, her eyes flashing. "This is outrageous," she said. "I won't sit here and be accused of murder over a hairpin and village gossip." Clara gasped, and Thomas rose, his hand outstretched as if to calm her. "Lavinia, no one's accusing you," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Craddock's eyes narrowed, and he made a note. "No one's accusing anyone yet," he said. "But we'll need to search your cottage, Miss Gray, with your permission. If there's nothing to hide, it'll clear things up." Lavinia's face was a mask of controlled fury, but she nodded, her voice icy. "Do as you must, Inspector. You'll find nothing but flowers and pruning shears." Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes darted to the door. The confrontation had shaken her, and Miss Marple knew that a crack, however small, had appeared in her polished facade. As the gathering broke up, Clara and Thomas left together, their faces drawn, while Lavinia departed alone, her head high but her steps quick. Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his expression a mix of admiration and exasperation. "You've got a way of stirring things up, Miss Marple," he said. "That hairpin and those crumbs, do you really think they point to her?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "They point somewhere, Inspector," she said. "And sometimes a little pressure reveals more than a search. But I think your men might find something in Miss Grey's garden shed, don't you? A vial, perhaps, or a trace of powder." Craddock nodded, his jaw set. "We'll look tonight," he said, "and I'll thank you for the nudge, as always." Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her mind alight with the evening's revelations. Lavinia's reaction, Thomas's defensiveness, and Clara's fear had tightened the threads of the mystery. She thought of her old friend, Miss Powlett, whose calm exterior had once hidden a fierce resentment, and knew that Lavinia's mask was slipping. As she stepped into the cool night air, the stars bright above St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple felt the pattern nearing completion, though one final piece remained to be found. Chapter 10. The Final Thread. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp edge, as if the village itself sensed the turning of a page in its latest drama. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage parlor, the glow of a single lamp illuminating her knitting, which lay untouched in her lap. Her mind, however, was far from idle, weaving together the threads of the poisoned wedding cake, mystery with the precision of her needles. The confrontation at the vicarage had left ripples. Lavinia's sharp protest, Thomas's guarded silence, Clara's quiet fear, and Miss Marple knew the time had come to draw the pattern tight. She had telephoned Inspector Craddock earlier, suggesting a gathering at the vicarage to tie up loose ends, and he, sensing her quiet certainty, had agreed to bring Clara, Thomas, and Lavinia once more. The vicarage drawing-room, warmed by the same fire that had crackled the previous evening, was a study in contrasts as the group assembled. Clara, her hands clasped tightly, sat close to Thomas, whose solicitor's composure seemed strained, his eyes flickering toward the door. Lavinia, in a dress of muted gray, maintained her elegant poise, though Miss Marple noted the faint lines of tension around her mouth. Inspector Craddock stood near the mantel, his notebook tucked away, his expression one of expectant alertness. Mrs. Clement, ever the gracious hostess, had provided tea before withdrawing, leaving the room to its uneasy occupants. Miss Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, began with her usual disarming calm. "Thank you all for coming again," she said, her voice as gentle as the lamplight. "I know it's been a trying time, and I thought we might put our minds at rest by laying out the facts of poor Mr. Baxter's death. The truth, you see, is like a piece of knitting. One must follow each stitch to see the pattern." Her eyes moved from face to face, lingering briefly on Lavinia, whose smile was a touch too fixed. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Miss Marple's right," he said. "We've made progress since last night. The lab confirmed aconite in the cake's icing, applied after it was set in the hall's kitchen. And we found something else." He paused, pulling a small evidence bag from his pocket. Inside was the green enamel hairpin, its sheen catching the firelight. "This was found near the kitchen door, Miss Grey. We've confirmed it matches one you wore at the reception." Lavinia's eyes narrowed, but she maintained her composure, her voice cool. "A hairpin, Inspector? As I said, there must be dozens like it. I'm flattered you think it's mine, but it proves nothing." Miss Marple's needles appeared, though she did not knit, merely holding them as if to anchor her thoughts. "Perhaps not alone," she said softly, "but it's one of many threads. Clara saw you near the sideboard where the cake was kept. Miss Gray and Elsie, the maid, noticed a woman in a green dress, your dress, by the kitchen. Mr. Elliot saw you in the alley carrying a basket, and young Tommy confirmed it. You were there. During the half hour, Mr. Reed left the cake unattended." Lavinia's smile tightened, but she said nothing, her hands folded in her lap. Clara shifted, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Lavinia, I didn't want to believe it, but Mr. Baxter told me he knew something about you, something from your past. He said it was an old scandal, and I saw you arguing with him at the reception. You were so angry." Lavinia's eyes flashed, but she laughed, a sound brittle as glass. "Arguing? Clara, dear, it was a friendly chat. Mr. Baxter was a tease, nothing more. As for scandals, I'm sure he meant it in jest. My past is hardly exciting enough for such tales." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "But it wasn't just jest, was it?" she said. "Mr. Baxter had a way of stirring things up. Thomas, you mentioned he teased you about a business deal, a land deal that didn't go as planned. And Clara heard him hint at something more personal about Miss Gray. It's curious, isn't it, how these things connect?" Thomas's jaw tightened, and he glanced at Clara, his hand covering hers. "It was nothing serious," he said, his voice low. "Baxter liked to needle people, but it was all talk." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, a single deliberate sound. "Talk can be dangerous," she said, "especially when it threatens to uncover something one wishes to keep hidden. Miss Gray, you've always been so careful with your reputation, like your garden, every bloom in its place. But a scandal, even an old one, could disrupt that, couldn't it? And Clara's happiness with Thomas, well, that must have been a bitter pill after your own hopes were dashed." Lavinia's face paled, her hands clenching briefly before relaxing. "You're weaving quite a story, Miss Marple," she said, her voice icy. "But you've no proof. I arranged flowers. I mingled with guests. I had no reason to harm anyone." Craddock stepped forward, his tone firm. "That's where you're wrong, Miss Gray. My men searched your cottage this afternoon. With your permission, in your garden shed, hidden behind a stack of pots, we found a small vial with traces of aconite powder. The lab's testing it now, but it's a strong match to what was in the cake." The room fell silent, the fire's crackle suddenly loud. Clara gasped, and Thomas's eyes widened, his hand tightening on Clara's. Lavinia's composure wavered, her eyes darting to the door, but she held her ground. "A vial?" she said, her voice trembling now. "That's absurd. Anyone could have put it there." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her voice remained steady. "Anyone, perhaps," she said. "But the threads point to you, Miss Gray. You knew the hall's layout, the unlocked door, the open window. You had aconite in your garden, and the knowledge to use it. You were seen near the cake, and your hairpin was found by the kitchen. And then there's Mr. Baxter's teasing. About a scandal. Perhaps something from your family's past, something you feared he'd reveal. Poisoning the cake would ruin Clara's day, and silence him, wouldn't it? A clever plan, though it went terribly wrong." Lavinia stood, her face white, her hands trembling. "This is nonsense," she cried. "I won't be accused on such flimsy evidence." But her voice cracked, and Miss Marple saw the fear in her eyes, the mask slipping at last. Craddock's voice was calm but unyielding. "We'll need you to come to the station, Miss Gray, to answer some questions. The vial's being analyzed, and we'll know soon enough." Lavinia's shoulders slumped, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of collapse. Then, with a visible effort, she straightened, her voice low. "Very well, Inspector, but you're making a mistake." As Craddock escorted Lavinia out, Clara buried her face in Thomas's shoulder, her sobs muffled. Thomas held her close, his face a mix of relief and sorrow. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her expression one of quiet sadness. "Such a pity," she said softly. "Jealousy and fear can twist even the most careful heart." Craddock paused at the door, turning back. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said, a note of admiration in his voice. "That vial was a long shot, but you knew where to look." Miss Marple's smile was faint. "It was only a matter of following the threads, Inspector. They always lead somewhere." As the room emptied, Miss Marple remained, her eyes on the fire. She thought of her old friend, Mrs. Langley, whose envy had once led to a small but spiteful act, and saw in Lavinia a similar pattern, magnified by desperation. The vial, the hairpin, the crumbs, they were the final stitches in a tapestry of motive and opportunity. Lavinia's plan, she suspected, had been to disgrace Clara, with Baxter's death an unintended consequence, but the truth had unraveled her. Miss Marple rose, her basket in hand, ready to return to her cottage, where the quiet of St. Mary Mead would soon settle once more. Chapter 11. The Confession. The police station in St. Mary Mead, a modest brick building tucked behind the village green, was an unassuming place, more accustomed to handling lost bicycles than murder investigations. Yet, as the evening deepened, its small interrogation room held a scene charged with the weight of revelation. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in a corner, her knitting bag at her feet, her presence requested by Inspector Craddock, who valued her insight into the human heart. Across a plain wooden table sat Miss Lavinia Gray, her elegant poise now frayed, her gray dress crumpled from the short journey from the vicarage. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she clasped them, and her eyes, once cool and guarded, darted toward the door where a constable stood watch. Inspector Craddock, seated opposite, opened his notebook with a deliberate calm, his voice measured but firm. "Miss Gray," he began, "the evidence against you is mounting. The vial of aconite powder from your shed, the hairpin by the kitchen door, your presence near the cake, multiple witnesses place you there. And then there's Mr. Baxter's talk of a scandal, which seemed to unsettle you. It's time to tell us the truth." Lavinia's lips tightened, and for a moment she seemed poised to protest, her chin lifting in defiance. But as Craddock's steady gaze held hers, her shoulders sagged, and a shadow of resignation crossed her face. Miss Marple, her needles still for once, watched closely, her expression one of quiet sorrow. She had seen this moment before, in other villages, other lives, when the mask of composure slipped, and the truth, like a long buried stitch, came to light. "Miss Gray," she said softly, her voice cutting through the tension. It must have been a heavy burden, carrying such feelings. Sometimes speaking out can lighten the load, even if it's painful. Her tone was gentle, almost maternal, and Lavinia's eyes flickered toward her, a spark of something, fear, perhaps, or relief, flashing briefly. Lavinia drew a shaky breath, her hands unclenching as she stared at the table. "You don't understand," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "It wasn't meant to happen like this. I never meant for anyone to die." The words hung in the air, and Craddock leaned forward, his pen poised but still, giving her space to continue. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind remained sharp, piecing together the final threads of the mystery. "I loved Thomas," Lavinia said at last, her voice breaking. "Years ago, before Clara, we were close, closer than he ever admitted. I thought we had a future. But then she came along, with her golden curls and her sweet smile, and he was dazzled. I tried to let it go, to be gracious, but it ate at me, every day." Her fingers twisted together, and she looked up, her eyes glistening. "When they announced the wedding, it was like a knife. I wanted to ruin it, just a little, to make her day less perfect, to make her feel what I felt." Craddock's brow furrowed, but he remained silent, letting her words spill out. Miss Marple nodded slightly, her expression encouraging, as if coaxing a reluctant child. "The cake," she said gently. "You thought to taint it, didn't you? Just enough to cause a stir." Lavinia's head jerked up, her eyes wide with surprise, as if startled by Miss Marple's insight. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I knew about aconite. My gardening books, you see. I thought a small amount, just a trace, would make people ill, spoil the celebration. I slipped into the kitchen through the alley door when Mr. Reed was away. It was so easy. The cake was there, uncovered for a moment while Elsie was fetching trays. I sprinkled the powder on the icing, just the top tier, and left. I thought it would be a scandal, not a tragedy." Craddock's voice was low, but firm. "But it was a tragedy, Miss Gray. Mr. Baxter died, and quickly. You misjudged the dose." Lavinia's face crumpled, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, a sob escaping. "I didn't know," she cried. "I swear I didn't mean to kill him. I didn't even know he'd take that slice. I thought it would just make a few people sick, that Clara would be humiliated, that the village would talk about her ruined day, not a death." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Miss Marple's eyes were filled with pity, though her mind remained clear. "But Mr. Baxter was a complication, wasn't he?" she said softly. "He knew something about you, something you feared he'd reveal. Clara heard him mention a scandal, and you argued with him at the reception. Was that why you chose such a dangerous poison?" Lavinia's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with a mix of fear and defiance. "It wasn't about him," she said. "Not really. He knew about my father years ago, a business deal that went wrong, something the family hushed up. He teased me about it, said he might let it slip to Thomas. I was angry, yes, but I didn't plan to kill him. It was Clara I wanted to hurt, not him." Craddock made a note, his expression grim. "So you admit to poisoning the cake," he said, "and you hid the vial in your shed, hoping it wouldn't be found." Lavinia nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I panicked after it happened. I thought if I hid it well, no one would connect it to me. I didn't think anyone saw me in the kitchen, but that hairpin—" She trailed off, her eyes dropping to her hands. Miss Marple recalled the green enamel hairpin, its gleam near the kitchen door, and saw how a single careless moment had unraveled Lavinia's plan. "You were clever," Miss Marple said, her tone almost kind. "But the village sees more than we think. Elsie noticed you, Mr. Elliot saw you in the alley, and Clara felt your resentment. And then there were the crumbs, gritty with the powder you used. Small things, Miss Gray, but they tell a story. Lavinia's face was ashen now, her elegance stripped away by the weight of her confession. "I didn't want this," she said, her voice breaking. "I just wanted her to feel what I felt, just for a moment. I never meant for anyone to die." Craddock closed his notebook, his voice steady but not unkind. "You'll need to make a formal statement, Miss Gray. This is a serious matter, and there'll be consequences." Lavinia nodded, her eyes dull, as if the fight had gone out of her. The constable stepped forward, and she rose, her movements slow, as if carrying an invisible burden. Miss Marple watched her go, her heart heavy with the sadness of a life undone by envy. She thought of her old friend Miss Carter, whose bitterness over a lost love had led to small cruelties, though none so deadly as this. As the door closed behind Lavinia, Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his expression a mix of admiration and relief. "You saw it all, didn't you?" he said. "The hairpin, the crumbs, the way she reacted at the vicarage. You knew she'd crack." Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost wistful. "I only followed the threads, Inspector," she said. "People are not so different from knitting, you know. A dropped stitch, a tangled skein. It all comes clear if you look closely." Craddock chuckled, shaking his head. "You make it sound simple, Miss Marple. I'll need your statement too, but I suspect you've already written it in your head." Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag, her movements slow and deliberate. "I'll put it down properly, Inspector," she said. "But it's a sad business, isn't it? So much pain for a moment's spite." She stepped into the night, the air cool against her face, and walked home under the starlit sky. Lavinia's confession had closed the case, but Miss Marple felt no triumph, only the quiet resolve of one who had seen human nature's frailties laid bare. The village would talk, as it always did, but the truth, like a finished piece of knitting, was now complete, its pattern clear at last. Chapter 12. The Village Restored. The morning sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead, casting a warm glow across the village's thatched roofs and dew-kissed gardens. The air, crisp with the promise of autumn, carried the scent of wood smoke and freshly turned earth, as if the village itself were exhaling a sigh of relief. The tragedy of Clara and Thomas's wedding, though still a tender wound, was beginning to fade into the rhythm of daily life. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor window, her knitting a soft cascade of wool in her lap, her eyes tracing the familiar outlines of the high street. The village was stirring back to its quiet ways, but Miss Marple knew that beneath its calm surface, hearts were mending, and secrets, now laid bare, were settling into the past. Lavinia Gray's arrest had sent ripples through St. Mary Mead, though the gossip, once feverish, was softening into murmurs of pity and disbelief. Miss Marple, who had seen the confession unfold in the stark light of the police station, felt no satisfaction, only the quiet sorrow of one who understood the cost of envy. Lavinia's plan, born of a wounded heart, had spiraled into tragedy, claiming Mr. Baxter's life and nearly shattering Clara's happiness. Yet, as Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, she reflected that the village, like a well-tended garden, had a way of healing itself, given time. She rose, adjusting her shawl, and stepped into her small garden, where the roses were still in bloom, their petals a delicate contrast to the monkshood she had seen in Lavinia's plot. The memory of those purple blooms beautiful and deadly, lingered in her mind, a reminder of how closely beauty and danger could intertwine. As she snipped a faded bloom, her thoughts turned to Clara and Thomas, who had faced the shadow of suspicion with courage. She had heard from Mrs. Clement that they were planning a quiet vow renewal, a private ceremony to reclaim their joy, and Miss Marple smiled, her heart warmed by the resilience of youth. Her morning walk took her past Mr. Reed's bakery, where the green awning fluttered cheerfully in the breeze. The shop was bustling again, its windows filled with golden loaves and delicate pastries, a testament to the village's trust in the baker's skill. Mr. Reed, wiping his hands on his apron, greeted her with a nod, his face no longer etched with worry. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he called. "Thanks to you, folk are eating my cakes again." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Your cakes were never at fault, Mr. Reed," she said. "It was only a matter of finding the right thread." He chuckled, offering her a scone, which she accepted with a gracious smile, tucking it into her basket for later. At the vicarage, she found Clara in the garden, a shawl around her shoulders, her face brighter than it had been in days. "Miss Marple," Clara said, rising to meet her, "I can't thank you enough. If you hadn't seen through it all—" Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch light but steady. "My dear, it was only a matter of looking closely," she said. "You and Thomas have a long life ahead, and this will be but a memory." Clara's smile was tentative but genuine. "We're having a small ceremony next week," she said. "Just family and a few friends. Will you come?" Miss Marple nodded, her heart lifting. "I wouldn't miss it, Clara." As she walked home, Miss Marple passed the church, where the vicar was tending the flower beds, the monk's hood now carefully removed at his request. He waved, his face thoughtful. "A sad business, Miss Marple," he said, "but the village is quieter now, thanks to you." Miss Marple shook her head, her smile modest. "The village finds its own peace, Mr. Clement," she said. "I only helped it along." She continued on, her steps slow, her mind turning over the events of the past days. Lavinia's confession had closed the case, but it had also revealed the fragility of human hearts, so easily swayed by jealousy and fear. Back in her parlor, Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting resumed, the needles moving with the rhythm of her thoughts. She thought of her old friend, Mrs. Harmon, whose own brush with village scandal had taught her the power of small acts of spite. Lavinia's plan, meant to wound Clara, had spiraled into a tragedy that none could have foreseen, and Miss Marple wondered, as she often did, at the thin line between intention and consequence. "Jealousy," she murmured, her voice soft as the wool in her hands, "is a poison deadlier than aconite." Outside, the village hummed with life, children laughing, carts rattling, the church bell tolling the hour. St. Mary Mead was itself again, its peace restored, though Miss Marple knew it would always hold its secrets, waiting for a keen eye to uncover them. She smiled, her needles clicking, and turned her gaze to the garden, where the roses nodded in the breeze, a quiet promise of new beginnings.